Year 11s, we are going to be looking at eukaryotic cells today. Particularly what we're going to be looking at is how they compare to prokaryotic cells, what structures they have within them. We're going to leave the organelles themselves to the next video. So first of all, what are eukaryotic cells? Well, generally, or as a very broad description, they are just more specific, more complex than prokaryotic cells. They have more stuff stored in them. Organisms that are made up of eukaryotic cells are called eukaryotes. There's a video on this first slide here which I would recommend that you have a look at, which is just looking at what makes up eukaryotic cells. It's quite long, but it's very descriptive. Now again, just like with prokaryotes, there are particular things that eukaryotic cells all need to have. So, they all need to have a cell membrane. They all need to have DNA, which will be enclosed in a nucleus. They will all be made up of organelles. They will all have a cytosol within their cell membrane, which is going to have all of these dissolved solids, salts and water made up in them. There are some things that only some eukaryotic cells contain though. Some eukaryotic cells have a large central vacuole. This is specific for plants. Most will have some kind of vesicle. They will have some small membrane-bound sac. They will all have a nucleus which protects, that's that enclosure of their DNA, of their chromosome. They will all have some will have a cell wall, and they will all have this cytoplasm. These organelles are the big thing though, the massive difference between them. And behind me in a moment we'll go through what the differences are when we get towards the end of the lesson. So with eukaryotic organisms, there are several different types. Animals are the ones that we're probably most familiar with because that's what we are. Animals are organisms that are able to move. They will hunt for their food, either as prey, as predators rather, that will go and seek out meat as carnivores, or they might be herbivores. There are plants, there are fungi, there are protists, which are algae. So there's a terrific variety, and the reason we have this variety is because of these organelles, and they allow the cells to do very different things. On the next two slides we just have some diagrams which show us what organelles are where. Those highlighted organelles are the organelles that you must know. You see with the plant cell there are several more highlighted than in the animal cell. Now that's primarily because the plant cell has more organelles, specifically the large central vacuole and these chloroplasts. Like I said, we'll deal with the organelles later on. So with the properties of these eukaryotic cells, what is it that they actually have? Well, all living organisms must be made up of cells. This is the cell theory statement number 1. But not all cells are equal. Not all cells are the same. In eukaryotes, this is very much the case. Multicellular eukaryotes undergo this process of cellular differentiation, which is what's given rise to the tremendous variety that we have in our bodies. In our bodies themselves, we have over 200 cells that we've discovered so far. Just a few years ago, they discovered another group of cells, nerve cells, and I think there were also some immune cells. So we're discovering new cells all the time, but we have at least 200 different cell types, and importantly, they all came from the same genetic cell, that first fertilized egg that was fertilized by sperm when you were conceived. Every single cell in your body shares all of its genetic information with every single other cell. But there's a massive phenotypical variety, and this is because of the way these cells are expressed. Cellular differentiation is not a major part of this course, but you need to be aware of it. You need to know how it's driven this amazing variety, this amazing diversity. But despite the differences, just like with prokaryotes, eukaryotes have to have some similarities. So eukaryotes are all going to have this ability to exchange materials with the environment. In fact, all cells need to be able to do that. They are also going to move in their environment. Perhaps not the individual cells, but all eukaryotes will. And then lastly, they're going to have to sense and respond to their environment. Hopefully you're beginning to see now there's some echoing with the first Mrs. C. Grant slide that we went through, or the second slide that we went through there. There's a little bit of echoing here, sensing. So we're sensitive to something. And then we're responding. There's movement here, there's taking in of nutrients, so we're exchanging with the environment, we're also excreting with the environment. We're building up this bank of evidence to indicate that eukaryotes are alive, and in fact, we know that they are. Where we're looking at some structures in common though, things that are always present, always a plasma membrane, always a cytoplasm which is made up of everything within the cell membrane, liquid and solid. There must be DNA, and then lastly we may have, once again, flagella or cilia. Now flagella are for movement, cilia are typically not for movement of the cell through the environment, or in a unicellular cell's case they certainly are, but in a multicellular organism's case like ours, the cilia are actually there to move fluid over the cells. And we find cilia in structures like, in organs like our intestines and in our kidneys, where we've got a large amount of fluid that we're moving over these cells so that they can take those nutrients out or take the wastes out. Now the next slide we've got there is our eukaryotic organelles, which is not relevant to us, but I wanted to have this description behind us shown here. So here we've got our eukaryotes versus prokaryotes, and it's just a summary of what they do and don't have each. So the cytoplasm, in the cytoplasm of eukaryotes we find organelles, we find proteins, and we find our cytosol, our liquid component. Over with the prokaryotes, however, we only have proteins and cytosol. Those proteins are predominantly enzymes, so they're doing things of the cell. Down the bottom, one further down, we have our outer barrier. Only some eukaryotes have a cell wall, but all of them must have a cell membrane. Whereas the outer barrier of prokaryotes, they all must have a cell wall, and they will all have a cell membrane. You'll see here as well that only some will have a sugar cell wall. Whereas over here for the prokaryotes, they have a sugar protein cell wall. So there's a small difference there again. Another example of how we can classify prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. And then lastly, we have our chromosome. And in eukaryotes, the chromosome is linear, so our DNA is in straight lines, and it's enclosed in a nucleus. In prokaryotes, the DNA or the chromosome is circular, so the DNA is contained in a complete circle. It will be wound up tightly so that it fits into the cell. And then lastly, it's unenclosed. It's not surrounded by anything. So those are our major differences in terms of structure. Behavioral differences, they're obviously related to that structure. Fundamental basic principle of biology is that structure underlies function. But we have our summary there.